Welcome back to the Connected podcast. I'm thrilled to bring you an extraordinary collection in which some incredible students take the driver's seat and host dynamic conversations with professionals from across the higher education sector, discussing the vital topic of student belonging. I'm delighted to introduce Callum Perry again today. Callum is hosting a conversation with Jenny Crowe, who leads the digital education team within the College of Medical Veterinary Life Sciences at the University of Glasgow. Jenny is also a part-time PhD student, currently writing up her thesis, which explores the concept of belonging, particularly for postgraduate students and those studying online.
I know that we're going to have some conversations around online spaces today, which I think is a little bit different to some of the conversations we have been having, which is all kind of about physical on-campus spaces. So really looking forward to having a conversation about that. I wanted to start by asking you about how you think your experiences, your practice, your research has shaped your understanding of belonging, and how you would describe belonging based on those experiences.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for me, there's not one size fits all for belonging. I think belonging is defined by a lot of experience we have and in our current situation. So a lot of things impact that. So gender, accessibility needs, income level, whether we're part of the LGBTQ population. There's lots of different things, ethnicity, that really impact us as human beings. So I think really understand what it's like from that person's point of view. But I think there's some interesting things about, for me, there's a lot of universities are talking about belonging, and in some situations there are some negative connotations about belonging, and for me sometimes maybe thinking about mattering might be a better word. I think because of my PhD research, I very much going down the belonging route, because that seems to be the term that's really being talked about in higher education. But I don't know, I've read a lot about mattering as well, and maybe mattering, and there is a bit of an overlap between the two, could be a better word. I don't know. So for me, belonging, there's a few elements: connection, support, and also what students put into the experience. So, excuse me, I think this, from what I've read, is a bit of a chicken and egg, like what comes first, or whether you engage or whether you feel like you belong. There's a bit of both need to happen. And it was very much what I found in my research. I think there's some things around trust and the university putting themselves out there, and staff, and whether staff need to lead that is another thing that I've been thinking about in my PhD research, is who starts the interactions, and who takes that responsibility. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about in the literature. I also think there seems to be in the literature around belonging some overlap between on-campus and online students about what works. I think some of the strategies for on-campus students do work for online students, and I think there are some assumptions around online students that they could be in another country, but equally they could be local. And so it's really thinking about who your population are and offering flexibility. So I think there's not always the case that they're somewhere else in the world. They could be in the next city to yourselves. But I think there are some differences in the population of online students, in that they're choosing online for a certain reason, and usually that's around flexibility. So it's around creating those flexible opportunities for those students. But also some might want physical meetups, and some might want extracurricular activities. So those ideas for belonging around those things do work for online students as well. So we almost shouldn't rule out online students from things like extracurricular activities, which I think is quite an interesting one. But equally, there are some online students that don't have the time. They're like, I'm working full time as a doctor. There's no way I have time to do extracurricular activities. I would say there's usually some differences with online students that I did research with. They tend to be a bit older in age. They tend to be, in some cases, a bit more senior in their careers. They are probably a little bit less straight from undergraduate. One of the really interesting things that one of the students fed back is with staff, they're looking for more of an adult relationship, which I think is really interesting, and more of a colleague relationship, because they could be a senior leader in their area, but they're looking to upskill in another area, or they're looking to expand their region, or maybe kind of change career. So I think some university staff are maybe in a place where they're kind of thinking that all students are similar to an undergraduate student who are straight from school. And so the kind of interactions and the connection that they're looking to make with that person is a hierarchical relationship, whereas the students are almost expecting this kind of peer relationship with staff and make those connections, which I think is really interesting. And I don't know if all academic staff are ready for that one, which is quite interesting. So
Yeah.
that was some initial thoughts.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly interesting, and I want to talk more about these kind of online spaces and online student experiences. And I suppose from your research and from your understanding in this area, online spaces, is this sort of an under-researched area at this point, or is it an emerging area? How is these online spaces and this conversation been brought into ideas and research around belonging to date at the moment?
Yeah, so I think there has been some Rivari has been done. It is probably one of my favourite people that I initially connected with, and so they've done some research in kind of asynchronous communications. I think there is probably more we could do in kind of online spaces. So I think there's a few different online spaces. So there would be the spaces that the students do their learning, so the virtual learning environment. Then there could be the places where they all meet together. So I really connected with the Beyond Blended report. I think it was just who released that, which talked about being in the same place at the same time. It talked about place and space and what we do together. I'd really encourage people to have a look at that. I really connected with that. And where are the social spaces? Where do we connect students together? And that might not be in the virtual learning environment. That might be on top of the video chats, those live sessions. Where do we create those peer connections? So peer relationships was one of the things that really came out in my research as something that really helps students connect to one another and feel supported in their learning journeys. Because often online students are juggling work and home life as well as their studies, so it's not always very easy. So they need some people around them. But it's how we make those connections, particularly in they're not in the same classroom, so they can't talk to the person next to them. How do they meet each other? How do they get introduced? How do we help them make those connections? And it seemed like a lot of our students were on WhatsApp and creating WhatsApp groups with one another. I know there's some concerns about WhatsApp around privacy issues and data sharing agreements. I think it's an interesting debate. We tried to use Teams in our university as well for these spaces. Sometimes they're looking for institutional spaces, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they like the convenience and flexibility of WhatsApp. And also on-campus students are using WhatsApp. And we're not restricting them. Why restrict online students? It's kind of a bit of an interesting one. I think there's something about how we introduce students to each other and how we make those introductions. So the students in the interviews I did really appreciated when they got the opportunity to do video introductions, and so they got to introduce themselves. You get the facial connection of having the video. So you get to see that person on screen, but then they also get to share about their work experience and why they're choosing that programme. And often at master's level, what we found is they come from a variety of different work experience backgrounds. They get to share about where they're from in the world, and it speeds up those connections. I would put a caveat in there. So if you have a cohort of 1,000 people, you're not going to watch 1,000 videos. So maybe it doesn't work with a larger cohort, but maybe it's a kind of small group exercise that you could do to introduce people. But how do they get to know the person that that might have a similar interest as them. So for instance, if they're interested in different animal species, or if they work in a certain area, how do they get to know people? So we found that the video introductions work really well for themselves, but also the staff, and to create that kind of initial connection, and kind of start building those relationships. But it's also about regular presence. So do they see the same names popping up? Do they see the same names in video chats when, oh, I've recognised that person, they were in that video and they're the one that's working in a similar field but maybe in a different country. And I think it's also connections from now, but connections to the future of like who could be a potential research partner, career connections. I remember a friend told me the reason why people do an MBA is to create your research network and your network of colleagues for the future. So the online environment is a perfect place to be able to create those connections, global connections. And one of the really interesting things about an online community is that they also get to share about what the subject area is like in their contexts. So in their health environment, environmental factors of like different animals, it depends on what subject area they're doing, but what it's like in their work context brings real diversity. So how do we get them to share that? Because I think not all students are very comfortable up front sharing that, but I think when we do get them to share, and I think sometimes that's a staff role of how do we get people feeling comfortable in the online environment to be able to share that, because I think when they do, it creates something really diverse and really varied, which you might not get in an on-campus situation.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, isn't it? About I've spoken to other colleagues about this sort of supported spaces, supported connection, and then organic connection and organic spaces that are kind of generated. And I can really see how universities might be able to support online spaces and structure online spaces to allow those things to happen, but also there is a kind of conversation to be had around what spaces are students connecting online with organically, and how does that foster a sense of belonging, and who has access to those spaces and who doesn't. And when you were talking, I was thinking about digital access, digital literacy, and I wondered whether you've come across any particular barriers around whether there's equitable access to digital resources or platforms, and actually the literacies and understanding on how to use those digital platforms that might affect how students engage with those platforms and the extent to which they belong then as a result to those groups.
So I think there's some interesting things about not one size fits all.
Yeah.
I think the comments in the research interviews I did was some students found the online systems really easy and some
Yeah.
didn't. Some found there was too much information, it was difficult to navigate. They really appreciated different flexible options, being able to speed up videos so they could watch them in the car going to work.
Yeah.
They wanted flexibility to do the learning on the go so they could fit it in with their kind of life. There wasn't so many comments about accessibility. They felt that the online programs were quite accessible. I think there's a bit of a caveat in that all these online programs had learning technology support. So I think that maybe speaks to that a little bit, that they were quite well organised compared to maybe if some staff were organising themselves. I don't know. I'm not going to make any judgment. But I think that is a bit of a caveat that not much was mentioned around the content. I would say that from my background knowledge of the university, we do try and support people with their digital needs as much as we can. We do provide computer requirements up front about what they need. It's not a correspondence course. They can't download the CD and then learn on the go. It is an interactive experience, so we do set that expectation up front. I would say that some of them expressed, I suppose, some lack of confidence in putting themselves out there and say, for instance, a discussion forum. I think things like their level of education or seniority compared to some other people in the course was kind of areas of confidence. I think there's some interesting chat about lurkers over non-lurkers and whether lurking is seem to be, yeah, I think sometimes lurking is a good thing, because sometimes I think not all communication is good, because I think sometimes if you're just repeating what someone else has said, maybe an emoji would be more suitable of like, yeah, I agree, rather than posting exactly the same thing. So I think sometimes lurking is a good approach, and I think what one of the things I learned about is how do we get people having a conversation rather than putting a single post? What are they interacting with? Are they interacting with each other? Are they interacting with the learner? Are they only interacting with the member of staff? How do we get them having a conversation rather than a single post? And I think that takes more time and effort from the staff, but also from the student point of view. And sometimes the students, if they're a bit time poor, they withdraw and only make their comment and don't take the time to really add into other people's learning journey. But I think that's the optimal, is if we can get more of a conversation rather than hear my thoughts and then I'm done, which I think creates a bit more of inclusive space. I think some other comments around inclusivity is like, how do we create a welcoming environment for all students? So things like what's said is inclusive language. Are we inclusive of different accents, of potentially people that have a different language as their first language? Is the language used on the course inclusive, so i.e. not exclusive? Does it of other different viewpoints? I think sometimes that needs challenged by members of staff if a student verges into a direction that's not inclusive, and how do we bring things back about so that everybody feels welcome in the course and welcome to share their point of view. It almost should be a bit of a petri dish of exploring ideas and discussion, because that's what we hope from that we can explore the learning together is the goal.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking then about, so we've talked about these online spaces, and I think what's really clear is that there are unique challenges and experiences for students that have an online access those online spaces, and there's further work and research that we can do around how to manage that and foster that belonging in those online spaces. What would you say are some of the kind of practical recommendations or considerations that we might need to think about for facilitating good online spaces that allow students to develop belonging?
So I think the space has got to be easy to use.
Yeah.
Easy to access for all. I think staff presence is really important. Like if students want to get to know the staff, they want to see them frequently. So I think, and staff guiding the learning experience, so guiding conversations, taking it back if things have gone off track, being around. I think frequency presence for the students as well in that environment. There is something about facial connection, like how we get people to facially connect, whether that's videos. I think being considerate of time zone. So not all students are going to be in the same time zone. Also, people might be working shifts, so they might not always be available at certain times. So given maybe a couple of time zone options. So if I've been running some sessions, we run them at midday and 5 o'clock. So that covers Asia, it covers the Americas. So, and it's flexible. So students really appreciate when that kind of thing is thought about. I think alternative formats create an inclusion accessibility guidelines. Subtitles are great and closed captions are great for those that English is their second language. Live sessions, students, although they can't always make the live sessions, they really appreciate and having that live back and forth conversation, hearing questions from others, getting the opportunity to get that instant communication was one of the things that was most brought up by students about what makes the biggest difference. Peer connections, so how do we create relationships with the students? Because I think they need some people to support each other, like questions about assessment, feeling like they're all in the same boat, having a kind of support community. How do they get to know each other? I think it needs to be interactive. having some good discussions, what we're sharing about diverse conversations. They really appreciate that. There's something about a welcome. How do we create this welcoming environment from induction to the kind of conversations? So I think that would be my top tips.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent. And I'm just wondering whether, well, we had a period of time through the pandemic where lots of learning switched to online and we had to really utilize and mine those online platforms. Do you think we've learned and taken steps from that kind of online pandemic, kind of what I would call like the pandemic pedagogy, and brought those through? Or do you think we've learned from that time, or do you think there's more that we need to be doing?
So I think there's some interesting things that happened in the pandemic. I think a lot of the teaching that was happening during the pandemic, they're now calling emergency response teaching, which
Okay.
was deliver that lecture on Zoom instead of in person.
Mm,
So with online learning, there's a lot more that goes into it, like chunking of content into smaller chunks. How do we create interactions online? So there's a lot more planning that goes into it. And I know staff were doing their best during the pandemic because it was a challenging time for both staff and students. I think also it's interesting to consider that the students that had to do online learning during the pandemic also didn't make the choice to do that. So I think there might be something around their well-being and being mentally prepared to be an online student.
mm.
And I think so maybe it's a slightly different population, I suppose is my thought. Because I think it was very different potentially if we were working full time, you had a bit more going on compared to if you were 100% stuck in your on campus student
Mm.
accommodation, having to do your learning. It's not quite the experience you signed up to because you were looking to have a good time with your friends. So I think there's something around a lot of the online students that I work with or that I interviewed with, they've already done a degree elsewhere. So this is their second degree, maybe their third. So they feel like they've had the campus experience. And so they're willing to give up some of that because they're wanting to do this qualification on top of everything else that they're doing. And there's maybe some kind of compromises in that. They're looking for that flexibility. So in some ways they don't always feel like students because they're juggling home life, work. So it's another of their different identities that they have.
Yes, yeah.
I would say that some of them want to engage with campus, would like to visit Glasgow. I think there's somewhat of a kind of bit FOMO,
Mhm.
um, that they kind of don't feel like proper students, which is quite interesting as well. But I think the fact that it's maybe their second degree, they don't feel that they're totally missing out from the on-campus experience of going to lots of extracurricular stuff. Although they are interested in things like, yeah, maybe some would like to do a book group or participate in research. There's lots of other opportunities that I think universities could help online students participate in. And I think they are maybe a bit of a forgotten group in provision for extracurricular activities and how they can be involved. Because I think people are not always very aware of them because they're not on campus.
Yeah, I think what was really interesting from what you're saying there is about the kind of relationship between identity and belonging. But again, a little bit like you were saying earlier, kind of a chicken and egg sort of belonging can help to develop your identity, but also you might have a particular identity which shapes your kind of need to belong, your want to belong, how you want to do that, and how you choose to kind of behave and access different services and experiences in your degree or in the life cycle of your journey at a university. So it's sort of both of those two things are really tightly intertwined and affect one another, and you can't have one without the other. But equally, it depends on the individual's experience, doesn't it? It goes back to what you were saying about there's not one size that fits all, and depending on your experiences, the background you bring, what you want out of your university education may depend on what you choose to want to do, what you don't want to access, and how you then belong, or what you want to belong to as a result of that. So I think that's really interesting. Um, we're coming to the end. We could talk for a lot longer. I know we've just kind of touched the surface on some of these things, and I'm really interested in the online spaces, and I think we could unpick that for a lot longer. But I just wanted to ask you really for kind of a key takeaway really at the end of our discussion. What's the key thing that you would like colleagues listening to the podcast to take away with them when they're thinking about online spaces for students and how that impacts on their belonging?
So I think the role of staff is super important. So I think some staff, feel a bit concerned when their courses go online that they will no longer be needed. But I would actually encourage people that they're more vital in the online experience and really get to know your students. They want to get to know you as staff, and they are out there. And so I would encourage staff to really connect with their online students, get to know them, get to know what they want out of the process. Because I think until you get to know them, you don't know what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the theme of staff and student collaboration has been coming up quite frequently in some of our discussions, and particularly the impact that staff play on student belonging, but also how staff feel that they belong to spaces and how they get themselves involved in those spaces. So that continues to be a theme, and I think it kind of throws up those ideas around co-creating spaces together and that kind of collaborative process between staff and students. So I think it's a good place to end our discussions, for colleagues to think about how can they foster that kind of co-creation, collaboration in spaces with their students to try and develop and increase levels of belonging in those spaces. So thank you so much, Jenny. It's been so lovely to talk to you this afternoon, and I hope colleagues are energized and invigorated by the conversations we've been having, and hopefully will want to connect with you on this work in the future.
Great, thanks very much for having me, and do feel free to get in touch. I'm very happy to connect with colleagues in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you for listening to the Connected podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out the rest of our extraordinary Voices of Belonging collection and stay connected.